Hi, I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to The Daily, where today we are focusing on a somewhat troubling power coupling, a tete-a-tete, but with fingers on triggers. North Korea's Kim Jong Un, remember him? Well, he's boarded his private train, much more of which in just a second. And he's left his country for the first time since COVID hit. His destination, somewhere in Russia, where waiting for him, of course, Vladimir Putin. So what do two dictators talk about when they get together? What is Putin looking for from Kim and vice versa? And exactly what is the catering like on board Kim Rail? Here to answer some of those and some more sensible questions, our military analysts Michael Clarke and Diana Magnay, our Moscow correspondent. Great to see you both. Obviously, an awful lot to talk about in terms of the meeting itself, but what do we know of this train, the Kim Jong Un Express? It looks slightly strange.
Well, it's bottle green. It has a yellow stripe, and we think there are about three of them. There's a sort of advanced train. There's the one that Kim Jong Un is on, and then one at the back, and it's extremely luxurious. It's extremely heavy because it's armoured, so it goes at about 36 miles per hour or something. I mean, a really laborious journey. Yes. And yesterday we saw images of a train going up towards the border and then back again. And I think that is the first train, just checking that there's nothing untoward on the line, no bombs, no nothing else. That's the sort of stage it goes. But I was interested because in Vladivostok last time, 2019, when I was there, it had a Russian Railways engine on the front, and Michael has given me the reason why, which I, as a train spotter, did not know.
That was the last time. That was the last time they met, wasn't it? In fact?
Yes,
that was the last time.
Yeah, no, it is one for the train spotters. That when trains go across international borders, they normally have to take, for legal reasons, they have to take the engine of that particular country. So if you go on the Orient Express, which I'm sure you do very often, Neil, as it goes through each different country, each country sticks its engine on the front of the rolling stock, where you're asleep in coach G, and the engines keep changing with every international border.
We know, of course, Kim doesn't leave the country that often. Certainly, this is the first time since COVID hit back in late 2019, 2020. So what is the purpose of this? It is clearly a meeting of some significance. Whether or not the two men actually sit in a room together, we will wait and see. But they've clearly both got an agenda here, don't they?
Well, possibly. I mean, yes and no. In 2019, nothing really came of that meeting, but it was important for both leaders to say we have an ongoing relationship, although actually it has never really been a relationship of substance. Since the Soviet Union, Russia and North Korea do not really have much of an alliance to speak of. Of course, the situation has changed dramatically for Vladimir Putin because of the war, because of the fact he realises it's going to go on for a very long time. He doesn't have the kind of ammunition he needs, and North Korea does, even if it's not necessarily of the kind of quality that means that he's going to be managing to get high precision weaponry from them. But it may help, and that may be the outcome of this meeting. But it would represent a radical shift in policy from Russia.
Where are the Russians currently lacking then, Michael?
They don't lack anything, but if this war is going to go on for 2 or 3 years, then they will need to think about the long-term stocks. And that's, I think, what this is all about. It's not that the Russians need artillery shells now, particularly, but they know they will need them in about a year's time. As best we know, the Russians began this war with a stockpile of about 20 million artillery shells of various sorts. And they look as if they've used between sort of 8 and 11 million of them since the war began 18 months ago. And so if this war goes on for another couple of years, they'll certainly go through those stocks. And the North Koreans have got huge stocks, so that we don't know how many, nobody really knows, and we don't know the state of them, but they're not believed to be particularly good. Nevertheless, if the Russians want to get steady supplies of more artillery ammunition, then North Korea is an obvious place where that could happen. But also, I think both sides will want to upgrade the quality of their ammunition. I mean, neither North Korea nor Russian artillery shells are particularly reliable. About 30% of them are said to be duds.
That high?
It has been as high as that. And the North Koreans, famously in 2010, they bombarded the Yongbyon Island, an offshore island between North and South Korea. And at the end of that process, it turned out that half of their shells hadn't even hit the island, they'd fallen into the sea. And of those that did hit the island, 20% were duds. So neither of them has a particularly good quality record. So they'll both, I think, want to increase the quality of their production and produce some of these precision shells that Diana was talking about, ones that have got little wings that come out when the shell's fired, that guides it through GPS and so on. Those are much more expensive, but they'll both be interested in producing that sort of thing.
I mean, is the problem for Putin that because of the various embargoes and because of the situation he finds himself in, he just can't get the supplies that he would have been able to in the past from other sources?
Well, I mean, that's the whole purpose of sanctions, isn't it? To try and degrade Russia's weapons capabilities. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have done a 100% successful job of that at all. But Vladimir Putin never expected this war would go on this long. So he has to prepare for the possibility that will go on a lot longer, because it doesn't look like there's a possibility of an ending. So it makes sense for him. Look, he's going to Iran for drones. He's possibly going to go to North Korea for weapons. But I think if the return for North Korea is that it gets a better weapons producing capabilities, that's not going to be very comfortable for South Korea. That's not going to be very comfortable for China. Both of those are going to have something to say to Russia if it transmits, better weapons capabilities or technologies to North Korea. So I think that's something that Vladimir Putin will have to bear in mind.
There's something we ought to say here as well, Neil, about South Korea, which nobody's mentioning so far. The South Korean government takes the view that they will not supply weapons to Ukraine, and they've kept to that. But they supply 155mm artillery to America, who is buying a lot of it, so that American 155 artillery is transferred to Ukraine. It's classic, weapons laundering, and the South Koreans are doing it with the Americans so that more American 155s can go to Ukraine, and South Koreans can maintain their purity by saying, we don't send weapons to Ukraine. No, you send them via America.
But and on that, I think that Russia's taken that very much on board, the position of South Korea, because shortly before Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, went to Pyongyang in July and walked around this arms exhibition and was given this whole great military display by Kim Jong Un, the South Korean president was in Kyiv. That is the kind of thing that Russia does not ignore, and it represents a change in relations between Russia and South Korea.
I mean, a question for both of you. I mean, when we're talking about North Korea and wanting access to better technology and technology that it can use with weapons, my mind immediately goes to the nuclear option, and perhaps they're looking for assistance when it comes to nuclear submarines. I mean, why on earth would the Russians be minded to hand over that kind of level of that kind of level of technology when ultimately, I mean, you've got a failed state that is crying out for essential goods, medicines, grains, and so on. I mean, surely Kim would be happy with that.
Well, he might be, because he's got a real problem. The United Nations for 2023 says that only 75% of the North Korean population can be fed, even at a very basic level. 25% are facing starvation, and that's a country of 26 million people. So there's, 7 million people who are now starving in North Korea, and the rest are not well fed. And outside Pyongyang, I mean, you can see it. There's people scratching in the fields for whatever they can pick up. And the North Koreans desperately need grain, they need oil. But Kim himself, of course, in Pyongyang and his military program, is drawing in high technology, but he's got some more immediate needs, which it's a natural trade. The Russians have got grain. They've got 60 million tons surplus grain this year, which is not quite as good as last year, but it's still more than they normally have. And they want to get it out to the world. And this is, I mean, if they give the North Koreans 20 million tons at knockdown prices, that's a natural trade, which I think the North Koreans will take.
And I think Vladimir Putin would also be very wary of handing nuclear kind of technology to Kim Jong Un.
You'd hope so. You'd certainly hope so.
As Diana said, the Chinese wouldn't like it. I mean, the Chinese are watching this very carefully, because they are the mentors of Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Un is their client, although he's a damn nuisance for them. But they'd rather they keep control of him than that he somehow spreads his favours between Moscow and Beijing.
But, I mean, Dan, just to pick up something you said before, of course, this is just the second bilateral that Kim Jong Un and Vladimir Putin have had. I mean, you've seen this a lot. I was about to say up close. I don't think anyone gets to see this up close, but a lot closer than I have. I mean, how would you describe the state of the kind of the North Korean-Russian axis at the moment?
There's no real trade relationship to speak of at all. There has for a while been North Korean workers in Russia, especially working on things like timber and construction. But Vladimir Putin has kept them very much at arm's length. So essentially, it's been the summit in 2019. Nothing came of it.
Does he not view him as a fellow traveller? I mean, I was being slightly facetious in the introduction. I was toying about the idea of talking about, a dictator's WhatsApp group that they're all in. But does he not see him as, as mentioned, as a fellow traveller, as someone who looks at the West with the same kind of contempt that he does?
I don't think so. I think Vladimir Putin, for his perception of a multipolar world, wants partners like Beijing, India, Brazil, African nations. He knows the perception of the world about North Korea. I don't think he thinks that Kim Jong Un is a sort of equal.
No, I mean, Kim is an embarrassment. That's the point. I mean, you may have him as a client, but he will say and do things which just embarrass you, as he has embarrassed Beijing many, many times, and they're stuck with him. But they'd rather be stuck with him than somebody else stuck with him, because at least they have, as we say, some sort of control. And this all goes back to the old Korean War, 1950, where Russia supported North Korea in 1950 when it invaded the South, and Russia was its only supporter. And then at Christmas 1950, the United Nations forces, as they were then, American led, were right up on the Yalu River, right on the Chinese border. And the Chinese, out of nowhere, came in and invaded, as it were, counter-invaded, and pushed the whole border back to where it had started from, along the 38th parallel. And the Chinese, in Christmas 1950, they displaced the Russians, they saved North Korea, and it's been their baby ever since.
Let's talk then, Michael, first, on the effect that this may well have on the tempo of the conflict in Ukraine. If we are correct, and if it is the case that Russia are seeking to kind of rearm themselves with what is on the table from North Korea, does this have any effect?
Not immediately,
yeah,
because the number of shells that the Russians can fire on any given day is not dependent on the number of shells in the back door, coming through the back door. It's the number of artillery tubes they've got. It's always called artillery pieces to you and me, but the military call them tubes. How many tubes have you got on the front line? And the Russians are having some trouble maintaining the tubes, because most artillery tubes have to be reworked and reborn after so many firings and so on. And so they've got a problem with that. But where this is important is that it shows that the Russians are now preparing for a longer war. They've accepted the fact that this is going to go on for 2 or 3 more years, and even Russian media are saying that sort of thing now. And in a way, this is a demonstration, although Putin may be demeaning himself somewhat, talking to Kim Jong Un probably about weapons, certainly that's what the Americans say. The other side of it is he's demonstrating that he will do whatever it takes in order to make sure that they can continue fighting this war. Just as NATO says exactly the same. We'll do whatever it takes to keep this war moving in the way that we think it should move in Ukraine's favour. And so there's a political message in this as well, that they're preparing for the longer term.
I mean, Diana, I can't recall where those comments came from, Michael. I think it was either State Department or the White House.
State Department.
State Department, yeah, where they were suggesting that, for Vladimir Putin, of all people, to travel all the way to the edge of the country to meet up with Kim Jong Un, to ask, to beg for munitions is embarrassing. I mean, do you think it will be seen like that at all?
No, and I mean that's a slightly unfair argument, because actually this is the week of the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. Vladimir Putin is there. That's where Kim Jong Un came last time. It makes sense for them to meet there. They are next door neighbours. I mean,
yeah, and it was the US State Department making this comment about it being embarrassing for him as well. We should remember.
Exactly.
If he is begging and borrowing for munitions off Kim Jong Un, that is embarrassing. But it's not like he's travelled all the way over there to do it. But the way it's portrayed in Russia is that for the Russian public, Ukraine is begging and borrowing for weapons as the USA's vassal state is the way it likes to be. Russia portrays it, and so why shouldn't Russia be doing exactly the same thing? And Vladimir Putin at the plenary session of the Economic Forum this morning said, these F-16s, any delivery of F-16s will simply prolong the conflict. All these weapons deliveries are simply prolonging the conflict. So he kind of gives the counter-argument for what we are saying now.
I mean, the United States obviously warning against any kind of arms deal between these two countries, but in practical terms, is there anything that the West can do to stop it?
No. I mean, they can't stop a sort of natural deal between, artillery and some other munitions going one way and grain and oil going the other. it will condemn it, and it will add to the sense that Kim Jong Un is an international outlaw in the eyes of the United Nations, and Putin is therefore walking through even more UN resolutions. So they'll get something out of saying that, but I don't think it'll make any difference to what actually is done in this deal. And as Diana said, I mean, we're in this situation now where this war is about lots of other things. It's become a sort of testing ground for the ability of the democracies to dig their toes in on, as we see it, international gangsterism, which is really what it is, as against the realignment of the world order and the time to push the Americans and NATO back and to realign things. And that's why this war goes wider and wider, and it's going to go a bit wider yet, I think, before it's too much older. And we should expect this to happen.
What of China? We've touched on it already, but what are China going to be making of all of this, given that, historically they have been North Korea's closest ally?
Well, you have a visit of the Chinese Vice Premier to Vladivostok, to the forum. So he's been having talks with Vladimir Putin. Bear in mind also that the one time that China got very angry with Russia so far in this war was when they transferred nuclear weapons to Belarus.
Yes, of course.
Having just made an announcement with the Chinese premier that the proliferation of nuclear weapons or transfers was completely unacceptable. A couple of months later, he went and did it. Yeah. So I think that's why, and certainly in terms of nuclear transfer, China would be ready to intervene. And as we said before, China and Russia both recognise the hermit kingdom for what it is, and Kim Jong Un for who he is. And I think that China, therefore, does and will play a very significant role in kind of trying to temper what Vladimir Putin does in terms of technologies going that way.
I think the Chinese they do want to contain this war to some degree, but they won't let the Russians lose. That's the position they take. Maybe whether they can do anything about that, but they take the view that they will not let the Russians run down or have their military run down to the point where they lose the war. Now, what that might mean, losing as opposed to being pushed back a bit or having to make a deal, whatever it might be. But the Chinese are biding their time on the assumption that by this time next year, the political situation will be different, and they may have an opportunity to step in to actually create some sort of end to this war, which they can live with, which does not humiliate Putin, but somehow pushes the West to tell Ukrainians you have to stop. That's what they would like.
So they don't necessarily want Russia to win either.
No, they don't. They just don't want
quite
them
like
to
the
lose.
status quo.
Well, this is it. I'm sitting here scratching my head. So how do you characterise the relationship between Beijing and Moscow? What is the relationship between the two leaders?
A junior partner relationship for Russia, where China is the economic powerhouse. Russia really needs to continue selling its gas and its energy and everything eastwards now that its westward flows are drying up. And Vladimir Putin needs China far more than China needs him.
And I mean, China. What the Chinese say diplomatically, the messages they send out to European diplomats is that you guys in the West, you're completely unreliable. I mean, you're enthusiastic one minute, then you're not, and we know that you'll flip flop. And we tell everybody only China represents consistency. We are consistent. And that's not really true. They're pretty inconsistent. But I think the truth is the Chinese don't know where this is leading, but they do know that at some point they will, or they believe they will have a decisive voice in the interim outcome, but they don't know what that is yet. But they're staying in the game diplomatically to see where the outcome might lead, and then they're determined that whatever it is, it'll be somehow favourable to them.
Does this then mean that we can rule out? I mean, I saw some speculation today about Russia trying to draw North Korea, as you mentioned, this hermit kingdom, out of its shell to try and make it into more of an international player. I don't know, to perhaps capitalise on their resources in matters such as the war in Ukraine and so on, beyond this simple, what appears to be a simple transactional relationship. That to you guys, I'm taken by your faces, doesn't seem to be likely at all.
I don't think so. I don't think. I think Vladimir Putin is clear-eyed about what North Korea is. I don't think he's going to try and transform it. He'll get what he can, but he's
I mean, the nearest North Korea has come to any sort of rehabilitation was the Trump visit. I mean, President Trump gave Kim Jong Un immense international standing by going to the demilitarized zone on the 38th parallel and sort of talking to Kim Jong Un and giving him statesmanship status, and all that went nowhere. But Kim Jong Un has actually had a better couple of years than he deserves because of the attention, first of all, that Trump gave him, and that now that Putin is giving him.
To what end will he? Sorry, and in what way will he be able to capitalise on that? Do you think then?
Oh well,
for a domestic audience only.
Yeah, Kim Jong Un. I mean, his whole raison d'être is for his family to stay in power. And remember, I mean, this is the man who murdered his uncle and arranged to have his stepbrother killed. I mean, he has no compunction whatsoever about having people physically eliminated. I mean, if they're even inconvenient, he just has them killed. We laugh at him because he seems so comical. But actually, he's ruthless, and his family are totally and completely ruthless. And so the number one requirement for them is to stay in power. That's what dictators do. They're staying in power becomes their version of what must be best for the country.
And his priority, really, unfortunately, is far more around building up that power by his military capabilities than it is looking after his starving people. So Russia has said, what we could give them is, the Deputy Foreign Minister said, humanitarian aid, and we're talking about sort of an economic lifeline. But I don't think that's going to be Kim Jong Un's priority, and not at all.
There's a wonderful image, which I sometimes use in lectures, of a NASA photograph of East Asia. One of these night photographs, and you see
exactly
all the
where
lights.
you're going.
Yeah. And there's all the lights all around East Asia. What a bright! You can see the growth of East Asia. And in North Korea, there's a tiny, tiny pinprick on Pyongyang, and the rest of the country is completely black. There's nothing.
I'm going to ask for some pure speculation now from both of you, which obviously is exactly what you like to hear from a presenter. What do you think Kim Jong Un makes of Vladimir Putin and the other way around? How do you think they view each other?
So I think it's easier to judge what Vladimir Putin views Kim Jong Un because I've watched him for a very long time, and I think that I think Putin knows exactly who he is, how to manipulate him, and he works people like that. It's just like Ramzan Kadyrov, except a slightly more possibly ridiculous version. He'll milk him for what he's worth, knowing that for Kim Jong Un, who has made a very long trip from Pyongyang to see him over
particularly when it's at 34 miles an hour.
Yeah, that it means more for Kim than it does for him. What Kim Jong Un thinks, I don't really know, but I'm sure
Nobody
he's
does.
portraying it to his countrymen that he's got this important state visit, and those pictures will be portrayed on state propaganda endlessly.
I mean, one's impression of Kim Jong Un is that he thinks that he has the answers to things, but one suspects that he does take some advice from just a few people. He certainly doesn't take advice from a lot of people, but his family has got such a rigid hold on power in North Korea that even if he says something completely ridiculous, it will happen. Things will be done in his name, certainly at the top level. And I suspect he thinks that he's far more powerful than he really is, but he's probably not as dim as the rest of the world thinks he is. And remember, he spent some time in Europe when he was a younger man.
Switzerland, didn't he?
Yeah, so he's not completely blinkered, but he is. But somebody, I'm sure, like all dictators, I mean, they all go mad after a while because they're in their own bubble. They just don't link to the outside world. Yeah.
I don't think Putin's gone mad, though. I think he's just.
We've got that to look forward to. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm just saying he's got very, very determined ideas that don't correlate in any way with ours. But I don't think that's madness.
No, I mean, even three-term prime ministers in Britain go a bit peculiar because by the time you're into your third administration, you're surrounded by people who just tell you what you want to hear, and you believe in your own rhetoric because you've won at least 2 elections. And so all third-term prime ministers in Britain have some very peculiar moments.
A little bit of politics to end on there. Michael, Diana, always a pleasure chatting to you. Thanks for coming in. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you next time.